Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to actually a joint meeting of the AIAA Niagara Frontier Section and the Ottawa branch of the of CASI of the Canadian Aeronautics and Space Institute on a very suitable subject that goes on both sides of the border, just like the Niagara Frontier Section. I'm Walter Gordon, chairman of the section. You're looking with the beard is Don Nixon, our treasurer, who's there to back me up if I lose my internet connection, and of course, our speaker, Chris Gainor. Um, he says he's getting an echo. Is anybody else getting an echo? If anyone else is getting an echo, say that in the chat. Um, so anyway, what do I want to talk about? So joint meeting with Cassie, going to talk about Arrows to the Moon. Chris Gaynor is our speaker, historian and author. Based on the bio he sent me, Arrows to the Moon was his first book, but he's had five more since then, including the official NASA history of the Hubble Space Telescope, which you can actually download for free from NASA. You can excellent book. You can Google it, or I also included a link to download it in the invite. And I guess that's about it. So without any further ado, Don and I will mute ourselves and turn off our video, and I will turn it over to Chris Gaynor. Chris, it's all yours.
Okay, I'll just get my slide on here and PC. Okay, so I'm glad to be joining you. The, uh, the story of me working on Arrows to the Moon happened a number of years ago in Toronto, actually quite close to the plant where the Arrows and the other Avro aircraft were made. Um, and um, and then, of course, my most recent book about the Hubble Space Telescope, uh, it also involves some of the history of that telescope with their mirror, including perhaps the mirror that should have flown on Hubble, which was made by Kodak in Buffalo. Uh, but and I did have a chance to check out that mirror when it was on display at the Air and Space Museum. But we're going to get into the story of the Avro Arrow and Avro Canada as it pertains to NASA and the moon race. Um, I suspect that a lot of people who are in this call, including the Cassie people, but a lot of the folks from Buffalo are fairly familiar with the story of Avro Canada, and I certainly uh, heard about it as I was growing up. I was quite young when it actually happened, um, but I heard about it over the years, including the part that Avro actually wound up giving kind of a gift to NASA and the U.S. space program. Um, and so in uh, 25 years ago now, the book you see on the screen here was published, which which tells that story, and that was my first book. So I always like to start here on this on the first Friday of October in 1957, and in on that day there was a big celebration uh, at the Avro Canada plant, uh, just beside the what we know today as the Pearson Airport, and the first Arrow uh, was rolled out for public viewing, and there was a lot of dignitaries there. The Minister of National Defense was there, George Perks. There were a number of people from the U.S. Air Force, and probably NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was going to be transformed into something else about a year later. Um, and and so this is a photo at the height of the celebrations, um, and that day would be engraved in a lot of people's memories because after this rollout took place, a lot of people went off to various places to celebrate, and they turned on the radio and got some news from the Soviet Union that the Soviets had launched Sputnik into space, the first artificial satellite to go into orbit around the Earth. This was a very sobering announcement for a lot of people because uh, it just gave proof that the Soviet Union had the means to drop nuclear weapons anywhere on Earth that they wanted to. They had already started to fly the R-7 rocket that you see there, um, and but that announcement wasn't taken that seriously. But when it had the satellite going overhead and people were able to see it, actually most people saw the rocket rather than the satellite, the booster rocket, or hearing the beeps from the satellite. Uh, that was a whole different thing, and the reaction of many in the U.S., including the government, I think is fairly well known. But it had an impact on the Avro Arrow, um, and the Avro Arrow uh, was uh, was capable of flying twice the speed of sound. Was certainly state of the art for a jet interceptor of that type, which was designed to defend Canada and incidentally its southern neighbor from bomber aircraft coming over the pole from the Soviet Union. Uh, but with the news that the Soviets had working ICBMs that could launch satellites into orbit, all of a sudden the Arrow became a protection against the secondary threat. Bombers were now the secondary threat. And ICBMs were probably the biggest threat to our countries at that time. Um, but anyway, at that time, people were hard at work building the Arrow. You can this photograph here shows the simulator uh, at the Avro plant, uh, and it had one of the biggest computers available at the time, an IBM computer, uh, and which took up a very large room and required a lot of cooling. And of course, it has only the fraction of the power that we hold in our hands these days. At the simulator here, you can see a fellow sitting at the controls. His name is Jan Zarokelski, who is a Polish pilot, veteran of the Battle of Britain, who came over to Canada uh, uh, after the war, and of course Poland was occupied by the Soviet Union, and he became the test pilot at Avro, and uh, he became he flew a lot of the important flights for the Avro aircraft, including the CF-100 Canuck, which was the predecessor to the Arrow, um, and and about 800 of those aircraft were made by Avro. It was actually designed to be a subsonic aircraft, but Jaruzelski and a few other people managed to fly it at supersonic speeds. Uh, but I don't think that was recommended. This here is a photograph of some of the leading people who worked on the Arrow. At the left is a guy named Bob Lindley, who actually had come from the UK, and Avro Canada was in effect a branch of the Hawker Siddeley Group in the UK. Um, and then in the middle is Jim Floyd, and he was basically the chief engineer, chief of design at Avro Canada, and had quite a career. And incidentally, he lived to quite an advanced age, and uh, and thanks to Don, I was able to find out when he actually passed away, which wasn't that long ago. Um, and then the fellow at the right is a guy named Jim Chamberlain, who I'm going to be talking a lot about. He was fairly young at the time, but quite a brilliant guy, the chief aerodynamicist on the Arrow. Um, and then behind them is a fellow named Guest Hake, who is also one of the top people at Avro. Um, so maybe I'll just sit back here for a minute. Um, so anyway, a few months after that first photo I showed you, the Arrow began test flights with Zurikowski and actually four different people from got to fly the Arrow. A fifth was a passenger, and three of the pilots were from Avro, and a fellow named Jack Woodman, who later became a test pilot with Lockheed, by the way, was the Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot on the Arrow. But over 1958, the test flights of the Arrow were going on, but we had a new government which was quite concerned about the cost of the Arrow. Incidentally, the previous government, which was a liberal government, uh, is also quite concerned about the cost of the Arrow, but it fell to the conservative government of John Diefenbaker to decide to do it with it. There's quite an involved story about the final days of the Arrow, but one factor was certainly that the other branches of the armed Canadian forces were not enthusiastic about the Arrow because they were afraid that it was going to gobble up their budgets for ships and tanks and what have you. Um, and so in September of 1958, the government John Diefenbaker gave notice that the Arrow was under review, and and there were debates that went on, and finally on February 20th, 1959, known as Black Friday, the Arrow was canceled by the government, and Avro. There was no thought given to what would happen after that announcement, and so the Avro Canada basically just shut the whole works down and gave everybody their notice and said, "See you around." And I've perhaps in hopes that might cause a reaction to cause the government to reconsider. They didn't, but there were now thousands of amazingly skilled engineers and technicians and other people who were out on the street. Uh, by the time we got to Black Friday, uh, the United States was well into dealing with the legacy of Sputnik and other Soviet space firsts from the time. And a new agency had been established, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, and that absorbed NACA that I mentioned before, um, and uh, and and some other institutions in the United States, such as the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out in California, and the Army Ballistic Missile Agency that was headed by Werner von Braun, um, and things like that. Uh, but the many of the people at NASA, uh, which by Black Friday had started a program to send American astronauts into space called Mercury. Uh, a lot of the people had come from NACA and they knew the Avro people quite well because the uh, people from Avro came down to NACA uh, to run tests uh, for the aircraft, for aerodynamic tests. There's the situation where models of the Arrow were launched on Nike missiles into Lake Ontario, and some of them were recovered a few years ago. Um, but also to do just some of the thinking about it, uh, about the aerodynamic qualities of the aircraft. So these people, the Avro people, were fairly well known in the US and known to people at NASA. So a few weeks after Black Friday, a plane came up from NASA carrying some of its top people, including uh, Bob Gilruth, who basically headed the NASA's manned space program until right through most of Apollo. Um, and they wanted to hire some of Avro's top people because a lot of people who were in the aviation industry in the U.S. were not sure that that was uh, joining NASA was the ticket to financial stability in their lives. And so they talked to a couple of people in this photo, Bob Lindley at the left and Jim Chamberlain on the right. There was some talk of lending Avro engineers to NASA, but that idea was scotched, and so um, the NASA people began to take applications uh, from the uh, from the Avro people. Um, and what we see in this photograph is actually the first and perhaps the last person they hired, NASA. The first one they hired was Jim Chamberlain, who basically there was not really the head of the Canadian group, but certainly the highest ranking one, especially at the beginning. And Bob Lindley, who you see at the left, um, actually went to work for McDonnell Aircraft and worked on some jet programs, and then uh, worked on the Gemini program. And in 1969, he left McDonnell, and which by then was McDonnell Douglas, and went off to NASA, where he was an associate administrator and held that high position in the early days of the shuttle program. But in in those weeks after Black Friday, NASA hired 25 people from Avro Canada, um, and over the next few months hired about a half dozen more, and then later on hired Bob Lindley. Now, the Avro Canada was made up of Canadian engineers, but also engineers uh, from the UK. A lot of people uh, came over from the Hawker Siddeley group in the UK and decided to make a change in in Canada because the living standards looked a little better then than Britain in the 1950s. So there was about 30, let's say 32, 31, 32 engineers hired by NASA, and about 19 of them were from the UK. One of those 19, I think, was actually Polish, like Jan Zerkowski, and the rest were from Canada. And some of them were hired for specific skills. I'm not going to go exhaustively into what everybody did. A number of them were hired because their expertise in computers, for example, and others in flight test. Um, but I'm going to be talking a fair bit about people like Jim Chamberlain. So in April of 1959, uh, the the members of the Avro group were whistled through in almost record time U.S. immigration because NASA was eager to get things going. Um, and many of them reported for work. Uh, and Project Mercury, by the way, was at the Langley Research Center in Tidewater, Virginia, just near Newport News. Uh, and a lot of them reported to work at the same day as a group of other employees who had just been hired, and their job title was astronauts. Uh, so, in fact, a lot of them went through the government induction process, filling out forms and sitting at little desks to hear about the rules of the place. Um, the hiring of the Mercury astronauts is also depicted inaccurately, by the way, in the Hidden Figures movie. It shows them arriving with a parade and everything else. There was no parade. They were all inducted like average employees, just like the Canadians, the Avro people. And of course, seeing as uh, seeing as there actually weren't that many people working on Mercury at the time, just maybe a few hundred, at least at NASA. They got to know each other fairly well, and some of them became friends. This photograph here shows Pete Armitage, who is one of the British people, with astronaut Gus Grissom, who was the second American to fly in space, the commander of the first Gemini, and unfortunately one of the casualties of the Apollo fire. Um, Pete worked on recovery systems, which was a big concern of Gus Grissom's because he nearly lost his life when his Mercury capsule sank. And after that flight, they used this boilerplate capsule here that you can see to improve the recovery procedures so that an accident like that wouldn't happen again. Um, and In this picture, you can see a lot of the Mercury astronauts and a lot of the leading people. Uh, at the far left, you can see Deke Slayton, uh, who had to wait a few years to fly, but he flew. And then Gus Grissom was there. You can see in the middle of the photo John Glenn and Alan Shepard. I don't think I need to introduce them to anybody. At the extreme right is Chris Kraft, who was in charge of flight control, and I'll be talking about him. And sort of the fellow a couple places over from Kraft with his chin on his hand is a guy named John Hodge, another one of the British people from Avro, um, who would be joining the ranks of flight directors. So this was the early days. Um, so this is the Mercury Control Center at Cape Canaveral, uh, which controlled all the Mercury flights and uh, the first Gemini flights before everything the flight control was moved over to Houston. And the Avro people had an important role in setting up not only this control center, but also the tracking stations that you see on the map in front of the controllers there. Now you can tell this is different from what you have in Houston because you see only one person has a television monitor in front of them. That would eventually change in Houston. But um, I had the chance to talk to Chris Kraft when I was working on this book, and this is a story he tells a lot. But he said we had to decide how we were going to control the spacecraft and stay in touch with it. Do we just have, say, the flight director with a red button and a green button, go and abort, or do we get something more uh, sophisticated? And so they decided to go with something a bit more sophisticated with a number of controllers with specialized functions. For example, taking care of the booster or the recovery systems. An important one was a fellow called and at the time it was usually a fellow, the Flight Dynamics Officer, or FIDO. Um, and he was the person who would know how fast the spacecraft was going and in what direction it was going, and what the options were if they needed to change things. The first FIDO was one of the Avro people, the lone Welshman, a guy named Tech Roberts, um, and kind of invented that position. And there's still a position like that to this day. A lot of the Avro people had been involved in communications and tracking of aircraft during flights. So they had a lot of input into the setup of this, including the setup of the tracking stations. And some of them were assigned to some of these tracking stations. Remember, back then there were no communication satellites. Um, and actually, a lot of these tracking stations were connected by telephone lines. And on at least one occasion, a farmer's uh, implement cut the telephone line in the middle of a flight. And um, so um, it was quite different from what we have today, and not quite as sophisticated. But the early flights, Mercury flights, were only making a few orbits, so you can see they had stations uh, under the places where the early orbits of Mercury took place. This, by the way, of course, is the Flight Control Center in Houston, um, and you can see there's a lot more monitors there. They aren't showing television shows. They're actually aimed at displays in another area, so that the person sitting using those monitors can see uh, whatever is happening in their area of responsibility. Um, this photograph, by the way, was taken just before one of the most famous moments of mission control's existence. Uh, the fellow in the foreground, of course, is Gene Kranz, and this was moments before the oxygen tank explosion on Apollo 13, in which Kranz and the other teams at Mission Control rescued those astronauts. But again, the this this control center, which began being used uh, for the second uh, manned Gemini flight, Gemini 4, which had the first American spacewalk, and it's been used ever since. This particular room is still there and has been kind of set up as a museum, but there are more sophisticated and updated versions of it just right next to it in the same building, which is named after Chris Kraft. So in 1961, uh, uh, the first Mercury flew Alan Shepard on a suborbital hop, just uh, uh, 15 minutes up and down. Um, but it was a bit of an anticlimax because a few weeks before that, Yuri Gagarin had made an orbit of the Earth. The, uh, the first human in space was Soviet. As a as a result of that, President Kennedy decided a couple of weeks after Alan Shepard's flight um, that to set a national goal of landing American astronauts on the moon before the end of the 1960s, and of course bringing it back alive. Um, there's a lot of discussion about what could the Americans do to beat the Soviets, and the Soviets, and it's an interesting story, but I won't get into it today. Had uh, their ICBM was larger than the American one, so they had a lot more flexibility to do all these space firsts. You know, they had the first dog in space, the first human in space, the first woman in space, launches to the moon and things like that. Um, but the American technology was still better, but they needed some time to catch up, and hence the decision that President Kennedy made at that time. So the folks at NASA, including the people from Avro, have been handed a pretty big job. Um, so um, 3 or 4 months after Gagarin flew, the Soviets actually sent up another cosmonaut for a full day, but finally, on February 20th, 1962, yes, the third anniversary of Black Friday, John Glenn became the first American to go into orbit, and and the effort to catch up with the Soviets was going on. Now, one of the people behind the success of Mercury was a fellow was Jim Chamberlain, who I showed you a little earlier. Um, Mercury was designed by some of the important people at NASA, like Max Faget and Cadwell Johnson. But uh, by 1961, when President Kennedy set that goal, they began moving off to think about, well, how can we meet President Kennedy's goal? By then, Jim Chamberlain was assigned to make these designs work uh, for the Mercury. So he was, for much of the Mercury program, Jim Chamberlain was the chief engineer. Uh, One of the things he brought to that was that, um, unlike the previous designers, he had production experience at Avro and at other Canadian aviation firms. Um, and so uh, he had a lot of experience in making sure that these flights were successful. So there was Shepard and Grissom flew those suborbital flights on the Redstones, and then John Glenn, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, and Gordon Cooper flew orbital flights in Mercury in 1962 and 1963. So here's a photograph of Jim Chamberlain at that time. Jim was born in Kamloops, BC, but mainly raised in Toronto. His father uh, was killed at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in the First World War, and his mother uh, moved to where she had come from, Toronto, and he was raised there, and had actually got a lot of aircraft experience even before he got to Avro. Um, so Jim Chamberlain uh, was brought in on discussions on on building an advanced version of Mercury, which at first was called Mercury Mark II. Um, but he did not like the design of Mercury because all the systems inside it were kind of stacked on top of each other. And when something went wrong on the pad and they had to get access something, they'd have to tear the whole spacecraft apart. And he decided that the way the systems were set up and where they were placed should be uh, done differently, and so that they were more accessible and they could make changes. But Mercury Mark II uh, was uh, was seen as a much more ambitious program than Mercury. It was going to have two astronauts, and you could see a model of the spacecraft on Jim's desk there. The astronauts were going to attempt extravehicular activity, spacewalking. They wanted to. They ultimately decided to have rendezvous and docking with other spacecraft, and you can see an Agena rocket, a model of that behind Jim, um, and 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 uh, and various other things. Longer duration flights. The longest Mercury flight was 34 hours, um, and it was going to be very ambitious. Well, Jim Chamberlain was even more ambitious than that. Um, just gonna go back here for a minute. But while he was embarking on designing the Gemini spacecraft, and Chamberlain was the person most responsible for its design, and he was the first program manager for Gemini. Um, uh, the folks at NASA were deciding, well, how are we going to land these astronauts on the moon as the president wants us to do? And there's a couple of different ideas advanced. One was just what we call a direct flight, like what you would think of from a sci-fi movie, where the rocket goes up, flies to the moon, turns around, and settles on its tail, and then comes back. Well, the problem is that you would need a gigantic rocket because you have to carry everything you need throughout the entire mission, and like carrying the Earth recovery systems all the way to the moon where they aren't really needed and then brought back. There's the other idea of assembling the spacecraft in Earth orbit. And then there was another idea called lunar orbit rendezvous, which is ultimately what was chosen. And there was a guy who actually wasn't even involved. He was at NASA, um, and he wasn't even involved in the in Apollo in a formal sense. But he decided to really advocate for lunar orbit rendezvous because the beauty of that was that you did not need as much firepower to get it there um, and back as you would with, say, a direct flight or even an Earth orbit rendezvous. But it had the problem, I think probably most of you are familiar with how it works because that's how they did it, was creating a lunar module that would do that part of the flight um, while an astronaut stayed behind in the mothership where where the rest of the mission would take place. But at the time they were grappling with this decision, they only had, a few minutes of flight experience, Al Shepard and Gus Grissom going up and down in the Atlantic. And so with Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, you were talking about uh, undocking spacecraft on the far side of the moon, 250,000 miles away, and landing them and then bringing them back together. That's pretty frightening. Um, it wasn't a popular idea, but the first person actually charged, who actually was involved in the manned space program, who agreed with John Hubble, was Jim Chamberlain. And how he expressed that support was suggesting, well, why don't we take a Gemini spacecraft and dock it to an even bigger rocket called a Centaur, and also have a small one passenger spacecraft that he called a bug to go down to the moon and then come back. And now what happened is that he was quickly warned off of that idea by Bob Gilruth and others, but it got them thinking. And finally, a few months later, NASA decided to go with Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And the rest is history. But um, Jim Chamberlain played a key role in that decision and went on uh, to design the Gemini spacecraft. Now, um, uh, Chamberlain, Gemini in its early days had a lot of problems, a lot of it from budgets being cut, to accommodate other things at NASA, just, other priorities in government. And so by the time Gemini started to fly with astronauts in 1965, uh, he he was no longer the manager of Gemini, but he'd kind of seen through the design and initial fabrication of Gemini in cooperation with McDonnell Aircraft, by the way, which also had built Mercury. Um, so there he was working alongside people like Bob Lindley. Um, and but Gemini in 1965 and 1966, 10 flights, 2 astronauts each flight. The first American spacewalk, the kind of one of the last big Soviet firsts was their spacewalk, and then the first rendezvous in space. So this is uh, Gemini 7, I believe, as seen from Gemini 6. And then later on, the Gemini spacecraft docked with the Agena and did maneuvers with them and learned some hard lessons about how difficult it was to walk in space, but ultimately overcame those lessons. And one of the person who kind of perfected that was a guy named Buzz Aldrin. Um, and so Gemini trained a whole bunch of astronauts who were basically going to be flying the early Apollo flights. Um, but they also trained the first generation of flight controllers. This photo here shows the first 4 flight directors. At the right is Chris Kraft, who's the father of flight control. Um, he was the sole flight director for all the Mercury flights, except for the overnight portion of Gordon Cooper's 34-hour flight. And then John Hodge, who the smiling guy at the top center, took that over. Um, and uh, and and then the Kraft was the head flight director for most of the Gemini flights until Gemini 8, and that's when Hodge became the first person other than Kraft to be the chief flight director. The guy sitting at the bottom left, of course, is Gene Kranz, who's famous from Apollo 13. And the fourth flight director is a fellow named Glyn Lunny, who is also quite involved, by the way, in Apollo. Hodge had a bit of a falling out with Chris Kraft, so he actually moved on from directing flights when Apollo got going, although he was involved in designing some of the uh, later Apollo missions, including the ones that had the lunar roving vehicle and things like that. Um, and he has another role, which I'll talk about later on. But uh, uh, anyway, by the time we get into the mid 60s and Gemini is going and the Apollo spacecraft is coming together, um, Chamberlain had kind of moved back to be kind of a troubleshooter for various things. But one of the Canadians who worked under him was a fellow seen in this picture, sort of the second from the right, and his name is Owen Maynard, um, uh, who I got to know fairly well before he passed on in 2001. And he he was the head of systems integration for Apollo, which was basically making everything hang together. Um, you have the command and service module were made by North American Aviation. The LEM was made by Grumman. Uh, you had the tracking network. You had the launch facilities and the recovery. Um, Sort of the person who was in charge of making this hang together was Owen Maynard. So he was one of the top people on Apollo. Um, I think you probably recognize Prince Philip in the photo. And the guy to the right of Owen is a guy named George Low, who was also one of the very top people at NASA in the 60s and 70s. Um, and I don't know the fellow between Owen and Prince Philip, probably the ambassador, but this is on a visit to Houston. And one of the jobs that Owen had was figuring out the sequence of missions. You just don't say, well, we're going to build this spacecraft and launch it off to the moon and land them on the first one. Somebody had to think about how are we going to make sure that everything is tested before we put the astronauts on the moon. And so there was a sequence of what they call the A to G missions, um, which started off with tests of the rockets involved in Apollo, and then the first uh, um, launches with astronauts on board, and then a test with the full spacecraft, including the lunar module in lunar orbit, and then closer to the moon, and finally the landing. And so uh, this was already being decided early on, but as we know, there were some changes, especially after the first Apollo crew was lost in a fire on the pad, the crew of Apollo 1. And that was a very difficult time for everybody, but the necessary changes were made, um, and the first flights in that sequence that Owen set up were flown. But they had to make a bit of a change. And what happened was the first Apollo flight with astronauts on board turned out to be Apollo 7 with Sherrod, Isley, and Cunningham. And they flew a Saturn I rocket and tested out the command and service module for 11 days in Earth orbit. Now, the Apollo 8 was supposed to be a test of the full spacecraft in Earth orbit, but the LEM was following behind schedule. And the CIA and other agencies of the government were hearing that the Russians, even though they had also suffered a setback in 1967, were pursuing their own lunar program to fly cosmonauts around the moon and perhaps even land them. And so what they decided was that they would fly Apollo 8 as a mission without the LEM, but using the Saturn V, and that it would go around the moon. And then the original crew of Apollo 8, which was already really trained on the LEM, would test the LEM in Apollo 9. So with a lot of people with a lot of help from people like Owen, they changed the mission design around. And of course, we had the famous Apollo 8 flight around the moon, Christmas of 1968, in this Earthrise picture. And a lot of us who were around for that, of course, got a lot of nostalgia watching Artemis III. But just to show that the Russians were in earnest, they were building this rocket, the N1, which you see here. The problem was is that they were behind the Americans. At first, they didn't believe it, when President Kennedy said, we're going to do this. And they thought he was just bluffing. And so they didn't do anything for a couple of years and then decided, well, we will build this rocket to match the Saturn V, but we're going to save money by not testing it. So an N1 never flew any longer than 2 minutes before it blew up. But they also had their own lunar module, which you see here. It would only take one cosmonaut down to the surface of the moon, and which I think was exceedingly dangerous. I mean, you can talk about how dangerous Apollo was. I think this would have been a lot more dangerous. But as we know, Apollo succeeded, and this is a photograph. Most of the photos you see of Apollo 11 are of Buzz on the moon, Buzz Aldrin. This is a photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon with the American flag. And also you see kind of a strip of foil near the American flag. That was actually set up to obtain samples of the solar wind. So Apollo 11 came back with not only samples of the moon, but also of the sun. Well, that was going on. People like Owen Maynard were down in this room called the the, uh, the span room, the spacecraft analysis room, which is right next to the main control center, and they had top management people there uh, to be on call in case there was an emergency. So you can see Owen Maynard kind of in the middle there, holding the paper. Actually, in the foreground is Tom Kelly, who is the uh, person at government most responsible for the lunar module. So he's a New Yorker. And the fellow with the eye patch is Dale Myers, who is from North American Rockwell, which built the command and service module. And this was during that flight. You want to know what kind of guy Owen Maynard was? He was quite a character, very focused on the job. And so, of course, he was at the control center when they landed. And then the next thing he was worried about was the next day when they blasted off from the moon to head home, which, of course, was the maneuver that was scared everybody from day one of lunar orbit rendezvous. Well, in the middle of that was the moonwalk, of course. So, what was Owen Maynard doing during the moonwalk? Well, his son was at home about to watch it on TV, and he saw Owen change into his pajamas and go to bed. And he said, Dad, you've been working on this for years. Why are you doing this? He said, listen, it's my job to make sure they get off the moon tomorrow and safely home. So I need my rest tonight. So that's the type of guy he was. Um, uh, Very focused. Um, so uh, as we know, Apollo 11 came back to Earth and was picked up by the USS Hornet in the Pacific. And the first couple of landing flights, they had biological isolation. Uh, they also got a Canadian greeting. You can see the fellow behind the astronauts in the orange jumpsuit. That's a guy named Bill Carpentier, who's actually a physician. And if they'd have had any problems when they landed, he was going to take care of them. Uh, he was also locked up in the Airstream trailer you can see there, and then later in the quarantine for 3 weeks. Um, so he did the first physical exam on the astronauts, even before they got to speak to President Nixon. And and then once that was done, he had some time to kill. So he and some of the lunar dust was loose in the spacecraft, which they had access to. So he was the first guy to look at lunar dust under a microscope. He also got another title. He was allergic to lunar dust, it turns out. So the first and only person I know of who's ever developed an allergy to lunar dust. Um, But of course, while that was going on, there were celebrations going on at the control center, and we can see at the right Bob Gilruth and George Lowe and Chris Kraft. And there's a fellow there to the left of the American flag who was one of the British people named Rod Rose, and he was also very important. He was kind of Chris Kraft's right-hand man and developed a lot of the flight plans for the missions. Uh, he was in charge of running the meetings and making the decisions about what would happen when. His job also involved keeping an eye on radiation conditions between the moon and the Earth, because if they'd have flown at the wrong time, and I include Artemis III in this, the results could have been fatal. So I found this picture of Rod at the celebration in Houston. So we had um, five more landings after Apollo 11, and as I said, or and for example, John Hodge was involved in setting up these missions. Um, some of the others, like Owen, actually left and went to industry or elsewhere after the first couple of landings. Um, and uh, a lot of the training that the astronauts did for their moon flights took place in the desert in western U.S. or places like Iceland. Um, uh, but for Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, the last two landings, they also came up to Sudbury, Ontario. Uh, and the nickel and things like that that they mined there were created by a impact similar to what created the craters on the moon. So this is John Young and Charlie Duke from Apollo 16 training near Sudbury. And you can see the volcanic rock there. They actually didn't expect to find that much volcanic rock at the Apollo 16 landing site, but as it turned out, that's what they found, and he said this really reminds us of Sudbury. There's a lot of scientific work done during those landings, by the way. I'm not one of these people who say that Apollo was about flags and footprints. That was certainly part of it, but there was a lot of scientific work uh, that you know helped us learn not only the early history of the moon, but also of the Earth and elsewhere in the solar system. The final landing was this one, the Apollo 17 landing. That's Jack Schmitt there, the only professional geologist who flew to the moon, and he is still around, but some of the places they landed were pretty spectacular. The Apollo 11 site wasn't that spectacular, but the Valley of Taurus Littrow, where um, Apollo 17 landed, was. And just looking back at Apollo 11, just one other Canadian part to this. You can see the legs on the lunar module, and the bottom part of these lunar modules, the six that landed, um, were all left behind on the moon. But all of those, the legs and the struts, not the feet, but the legs and the struts, were actually all built by a firm in suburban Montreal called Arrow, which to this day specializes in landing gear for aircraft. But that was one of their more unusual jobs. But of course, most, Apollo was, fundamentally an American program, and I think the most important ingredient, it was not only the know-how, but just kind of the will to do it. Um, Apollo was followed, of course, by the shuttle, and A lot of the Avro people were gone by then, but some were still involved in the shuttle in various roles. Um, I there's not that many pictures of the British and Canadian uh, uh, engineers from Avro as a group, but there's a couple of them. Uh, the British ones actually formed a cricket team and played a team from the U.S. Navy. Uh, and you can see a couple of them here. John Hodge is the guy in the black pants uh, in this one, and um, and a number of the Avro people became American citizens. Uh, some of them did not stay in the States that long, but uh, most of them became American citizens after a time. And so this is a photograph of some of them taken at the citizenship ceremony in Houston. You can see John Hodge there and Rod Rose, who I showed you, and Pete Armitage, who I also showed you, uh, becoming American citizens. They in 1994 they had a reunion of some of the Avro people, and that's where I came into the story. Some of you might be familiar with the National Space Society in the United States, and they held a meeting. Uh, uh, they usually meet around the states. And for example, a couple of weeks ago, they had their meeting in the suburbs of Washington. But in 1994, they had it in a hotel near Pearson Airport, actually. Um, and I happened to be in Toronto at the time. I did live there, but not at that time. Uh, but I went to this meeting not knowing that they were going to have a reunion of the Avro people. Um, and I showed up, and there had been some publicity about their work at the time of Apollo 11, and I still had some clippings about it. But anyway, they had their own room where they could swap tales, and so I spent a lot of the weekend listening to them, and that's where I decided to start writing the book. So Owen Maynard is shown here holding the LEM. The fellow uh, holding the kind of prototype LEM is a guy named Brian Erb, who worked on the heat shield for Apollo. As far as I know, he's the only one who is still alive. Uh, Most of them have passed on since then. Right in the middle is this fellow, Bruce Aikenhead, who actually spent 3 years at NASA and decided to come home to Canada and became very prominent in the Canadian space program. And he had just retired when that picture was taken. He had been running the Canadian astronaut program at the time. And the bald fellow here is a guy named Stan Galazowski. He might have been the smartest of the bunch because, well, he was a computer expert, but what he only stayed a few years, but then he got into the family business, which was running a Canadian Tire franchise. So I think he might have been the richest one of the bunch by the time that picture was taken. And um, then the fellow up at the upper right, uh, uh, James Ewart, who was one of the British people. Um, and then the guy at the right was actually a physician who served in the RCAF and served and then went to work for NASA along with Dr. Carpentier. He was the astronauts doctor, a guy named Owen Coombs, who was from Hamilton, um, and yeah, he had some interesting tales to tell about being one of the astronauts uh, doctors. But anyway, I worked on that book. Uh, this is just some of the astronauts that were chosen by Bruce Aikenhead, the Canadian astronauts. Um, the the first seven who flew. I think Roberta Bonder is missing from that one. Um, and we just marked the 25th anniversary of this event when Chris Hadfield flew up to the International Space Station and helped install Canadarm2 on that station. And of course, both the generations of Canadarm were a big Canada's big contribution to the shuttle program. So one of our astronauts really liked my book, so he took it up into the space station with him, and then later gave it back to me. And I asked him how they liked it on the space station. He said nobody could put it down. So anyway, that's that's basically the story in rough form. So um, these are a couple of other books I've written, uh, and also a stamp commemorating the Avro Arrow that I was consulting on. So I will leave it there, and if we got time for questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
That was terrific, Chris. Thank you very much. I'm going to you don't need to see me, but I'm going to take this off just for a second so you can see I have my full arrow regalia on.
Yes.
Your section chair is actually an arrowhead, my Canadian members. In fact, my background here is the Avro Canada plant in 1958. I just wanted to mention that before. But anyway, you don't need to see me anymore. Um, Anyone who has any questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A tab. I'm gonna make the Q&A tab visible here on mine. It was missing. Uh, I just want to mention a couple of things while we're waiting to see if you have any. You know, one of the pictures with Jim Chamberlain, you showed a little picture of an Agena upper stage in the background. And of course, I want to mention that the Agena engine, one of the most successful upper stage engines of all time, was made by Bell in Niagara Falls, here in our section. And also, when you're talking about Owen Maynard taking a nap during the moonwalk because he was so apprehensive about the takeoff from the moon, the lunar module ascent engine, which I would say most people will say is the most critical item in the entire Saturn V stack, was also made by Bell in Niagara Falls based on their success with the Gina. And
Yes,
go ahead, Chris.
that was very important, that engine, because there was no backup to it. You know, it had to work. There was, as we saw in Apollo 13, there was a lot of workarounds for a lot of things, but that wasn't one of them.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Kevin Burns just mentioned in the chat, I know that Avro worked with Cornell Lab in Calspan, but that they do much with Bell in Niagara Falls.
Um, yeah, I heard a fair bit about them working with Cornell. Not very much though with Bell, which um, uh, may or may not be indicative of what happened or didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, the work they did with Cornell was the arrow models were tested in the wind tunnel. And I had heard a story from an old head tunnel guy around my age that he had heard when he was young from old head tunnel guys who were there in the late 50s that when the arrow was canceled, these guys were told to destroy the models and that they didn't. They smuggled them back across the border in the trunks of their car. And neat story. I wish that it could be confirmed somehow.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that story, you know. Uh, Maybe not that exact story, but you know, there's this great legend that all the plans for the arrow were destroyed and all this, which is just not true. There's actually a set of the plans were kept, albeit under tight security. And the first few years after I wrote this book, there were still a lot of the Avro folks around, from all over the place. And I would go to events in Toronto or places like that where Avro people would show up, and a good number of them would show up with you know blueprints for sections of the arrow, and I have a couple of pictures of them. Uh, a lot of those people did help themselves.
Uh, Here we have a question in the Q&A from Blair. Sorry, Blair, I'm messing up your name. Blair Bromley. What could have changed a decision by the Diefenbaker government to cancel the Arrow program? It's a shame that everything was not preserved and put into mothballs so it could be resurrected later. It seems that the leadership of the Diefenbaker government was flawed, but so was the leadership of Avro.
Uh, the that's I mean there is some truth to that, but there's also some legend there too. I think there was an attempt to see if the British were interested in taking the arrows. There was only six that had been made at that stage, um, and uh, and they weren't interested in it, in part because there actually weren't that many extra parts around. Um, it was offered to the American government, but in the U.S. Um, they were facing a similar issue. I think there was an aircraft similar to the Arrow being built there, which was actually also uh, canceled,
Mhm,
because of the changing requirements.
mhm,
And um, but there's an important uh, uh, fact that I like to mention. In 1959, how many aviation museums were there around the U.S. and Canada? Um, and the
no
answer
idea.
is not very many. Uh, I can't think of any in Canada, perhaps uh, aside from kind of the initial parts of the national collection that's in Ottawa. Um, and now uh, I live about a mile away from a very good air museum in, and it's not the only one in the province of BC. There's quite a few. So it's the question of the disposal of these aircraft was not quite as cut and dried as it appears today. And there was security concerns and all that. The Diefenbaker government can be faulted for for not thinking about what to do with all these people once the Arrow is canceled. Um, but yeah, some of the other things, and it should also be noted that the people like C.D. Howe, who is in charge of aircraft production under the Liberals, uh, he had said that if the Liberals had not been thrown out in the 57, 58 elections, they would have canceled it too.
Hmm. Yeah,
Sad but true.
yeah. I want to follow up with you mentioned six, there were six arrows that were done upon cancellation. And of course, the sixth one was 206, the first Arrow Mark II with the Iroquois engines.
That's right.
And some people say, shoot, when it was canceled, why didn't they take that sucker off and break the world speed record and show everyone what it could do? And when I give my talks on the Arrow, I make a point that the Iroquois just wasn't ready at that point, and I simply say it was weeks to months away from flying, and that's speculation on my part. I was wondering if you have any idea how close the 206 was to flying with the Iroquois.
Yeah, I uh, I I I'm not sure exactly, but they were having a lot of problems with the Iroquois engine. This was a this was always something that had not been talked about, and while I was working on the book, there's a fellow who's retired over here who worked on it, but they were having uh, problems just producing the turbines for the Iroquois in any quantity. You know, I think it might have been possible, kind of on a one-off thing to try and fly it because, there was an Iroquois that was test flown attached to a what is it, B-47,
Correct. Yep.
um, uh, and um, but this was a big concern. They were just you need a lot of turbines in each engine, and 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 it was still kind of the early days of working with titanium, which is uh, very finicky and difficult to work at now. Now it's they've kind of mastered the techniques for that, but not so much in 1959.
Yep. Yeah, when the Iroquois was on the B-47, I don't know that they ever flew it at full burner. I don't know that the fuselage could have taken it, but at least the
Yeah.
book thrust of the engine, that one Iroquois could produce as much thrust as five of the six J-47 engines that were out on the wing, as five of the six engines that were actually on the plane.
Yeah, and there's also, kind of the famous thing, even with the Pratt and Whitneys, there was a flight where they got it up to just under Mach 2, and they were specifically ordered not to go any faster, even though
Really?
the pilot felt that they could. Yes,
I hadn't heard that.
yes,
Yeah, wow. Yeah. It seemed odd to stop at 1.98, doesn't it? Or whatever it was.
that's right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Under orders.
yeah. We have another question from Assad. While at RMC, have you ever met Dr. Bussier, who, as I understand, also worked on Avro?
No, I did meet him, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The only doctor I met who was related to the Arrow was Dr. Coons. Um, Dr. Carpentier actually just went straight out of university to NASA. But Dr. Coons, and was kind of advising on some of the human factor stuff
Yeah.
on the Arrow.
Yeah. Well, I don't know this gentleman Bussier, but he might have been a PhD doctor and not an MD doctor. I'm not
Quite
sure.
possibly, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, any other questions, comments? I mean, this really was a great talk. Um, I want to mention one thing. You talked about John Hodge several times, and several years ago, the Niagara Frontier section of AIAA stood up a Young Professional Award for engineers 35 and under. And you can see more about it on our website. In fact, I'm going to put our website in the chat, which is brand new. We never had a website before. Um, we've named our Young Professional Award after John Hodge. Because he did so much when he was young. In fact, when he was the Blue Flight Director on the last Mercury mission, he was 34 years old. He would have been eligible for our Young Professional Award, and because of his service in the Niagara Frontier section at Avro, the section today, and then on the other side of the border at NASA, we thought, what better person to it would be emblematic of our award, being both young and working on both sides of the border, as our section is in New York, Ontario, and Quebec. So our award is named after him.
That's right. He had an interesting career. Actually, after he retired from NASA in during Apollo, he actually came back to Toronto for a while and worked on some advanced um, transportation concepts, and then went back to the States uh, and was quite involved in getting the space station program going. At the time he was there, it was the space station Freedom, but eventually, of course, it became the International Space Station. So that's another big contribution he made. Uh, although by then he wouldn't have been eligible for that award.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. It doesn't look like there are any other questions. Chris, this was terrific. Thank you so much. Maybe we'll bring you back sometime to talk about another subject based on one of your other books.
That would be great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and we will see you. We don't know who our July speaker is, but we will have one. So perhaps we'll see you again in a month. Oh, wait, wait, wait. It looks like there's a question in the Q&A. Oh, here. What are the lessons? This is a pretty good question. What are the lessons for Canada for the future based on the Arrow?
Um, well, I think I th I think sort of during that program, and of course at its end, a little bit more forward thinking was needed. Um, One comment I will make though is that even though that was a loss, it was not the it was not the catastrophe that kind of ended Canada's aviation industry that a lot of people think it was. Because we still, um, for a long time, uh, even into the past decade, Canada has had one of the larger aviation industries in the world. Like, you know, the United States being number one, Europe being number two, and of course, in all these countries, you've had all these firms amalgamate, right? All the great names a lot of the great names of the 50s and 60s in the U.S. emerged, as well as in Europe. There's kind of like one big firm in Europe, and the same thing happened in Canada. And a lot of people think, well, uh, that wouldn't have happened in Canada if we still had the Arrow, and we still actually have a fairly decent uh, aviation industry when especially when you consider our size relative to other places. But for a lot of years, there was, as I said, the United States, Europe, and often Canada and Brazil, of all places, have been jostling for the third and fourth spots. And probably a lot of people will be aware of Brazil because they have they build a lot of commuter aircraft, just like Canada has been doing. But
Mhm.
of course, the Arrow, that was kind of the end of us building, um, military uh, jets like that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I personally was very disappointed to see the CS-100 and 300 become the A220. Uh,
Yes,
you mentioned the Brazil aircraft, the Bombardier. I've flown on that airplane. That is a beautiful, beautiful airplane, and it's a pity that it's considered Airbus now and not Bombardier.
that's right. It's a really tough business.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, someone said Brazil now owns Tim Hortons. Is that right?
That that's right. There's there's this huge conglomerate that owns a lot of the food service things, and I believe that Tim Hortons is one of them.
Wow.
So,
Yeah, thank you for that, Blair. Oh. Okay, well, again, thank you very much, everyone. I mean, everyone's hanging on till the bitter end. No one's logging off. So obviously a very good talk. Thank you, Chris, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
okay, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yep. Good night, everyone.